So welcome students, and as you know we are going to discuss the paper which was asked today. And today first thing, very important thing is we are going to discuss the paper 1 of the geography optional today, and tomorrow we will be discussing at the same time, that is 6 p.m., the paper of geography optional paper 2. And again, as I told you, it will be 6 p.m. same time. Okay, so I think this paper should bring smiles to many of the geography students, which we have been like, look, low sound aa raha hai bachcho ko. Okay, we are checking into that. So it should actually bring back the smiles to the geography optional students. I certainly smiled and became really happy, because if we look into, probably after long time, and ultimately we have finally, it seems कि थोड़ी दया आ गई geography optional students पे UPSC को, and the paper was comparatively easier if you compare it with the papers which have been asked in the recent times. And I just now saw the paper 2 as well. So paper 2, if you talk about, was also on the easier side, I would say. And easy, matlab, when I'm saying easy, I would say that it was somewhere between, if I talk about the level of difficulty. So the level of difficulty I would place, and from the person who has prepared well, from this that perspective, और अगर दूसरी भाषा में कहें prepared well, तो guidance student. So obviously we would say that it was somewhere between, somewhere around moderate level of difficulty. It was not so much easy. When I'm using the term easy, I am essentially referring to the comparison with the previous year papers, the most recent papers which have been held. And in comparison, I would say that it was easier, but overall, if we look from the uh, standalone perspective, we can say that the paper was somewhere moderate. Okay, and I believe that the guidance students would have been one of the happiest fellas today, because almost everything which we did in our classes, whether it is the optional foundation classes or whether if you talk about it is the 500 plus classes, it was there. I have already got so many messages from the students who have told me and expressed their happiness with the paper. So hopefully, let us see this happiness also translates into the marks and the results. That is the most crucial thing, as you can understand. Okay, so first, what we are going to do, this is just a preview of the paper which we'll be taking up, and it will be followed later on by detailed discussion, and I'll tell you how these detailed discussions would be there. Now, so if I just look into first the paper, most of my students, सबको पहला क्वेश्चन देखते ही मेरी याद तो आई होगी. टेल मी, पहला क्वेश्चन देख के याद आई? और अगर तुम लोगों को याद है तो आई हैव अगेन एंड अगेन रिपीटेड दैट UPSC is playing a psychological trick. As I have told you so many times that in the examination that there are three types of questions, and if you talk about, there is presence of direct questions. So there were so many of the direct questions which were there. There were some questions which could be classified as tricky, and there were some questions which can be called as the exceptional type of questions. So they're always there. This bar, however, one thing is very clear, कि exceptional questions were very less. And more or less, there was something we could have written in most of the questions. So the question arises, who would be excelling in this paper? The person who had prepared the classes very well, the content which was given to you, it was on your tips, you would have revised. So you would definitely do very well in this category, and this would also translate into this one. So that is the first thing, which was the prerequisite. Second thing, very important, the prerequisite was that choice of the questions. I have told you before also so many times, choice of the questions makes a huge difference, huge difference. Sometimes what happens, students, they just choose on the basis of maybe first question they know very well, and they'll not look properly into the other questions which were asked. And on the basis of that, what will happen? They'll just ultimately choose the question and write, and later they'll realize that they should have actually chosen other questions, which was a more balanced, where you had good content in all the three rather than very good content in one of the questions. So that is basically what I would say that was very crucial in this paper. And the first thing which I always say, कि first question जो UPSC पूछता है, that is it is playing a psychological trick with you. What it is doing, it is asking this category of question as the first question. So what it does, it creates a psychological barrier. और देखो, ये जो पहला क्वेश्चन था ना, define speleothems and discuss the various forms and features of the speleothems. What would have happened? Almost 50% of the students writing the exam वो वहीं पर बाहर हो गए होंगे because of just this psychological trap. So again, if you were already aware, and I hope believe that if you're a guidance student, we have prepared you, we have given you so many tests where we always used to keep the first question to be very difficult, on the difficult side. So you wouldn't have faced this kind of psychological barrier because you were already trained for this thing. Okay. Although this year the question speleothem which was asked, it was also not so much difficult. I have used this in the classes. I always use when I'm talking about the caste cycle, or if I'm talking about the caste landforms, I have always used the term speleothems. Okay. Now it depends when the question is not known to you so much. It depends how much we are able to get maximum amount of marks, कितना मिल सकता है. So obviously इसमें I won't expect that anyone getting 6-7 marks out of 10. But even if you were in the range of 3 to 4, you have done well. Okay. So there were number of, if you talk about questions were there here. And now coming to what I'm saying about the choice of the questions. So choice of the questions. Now, again, choice would vary from your preparation. Some people would have prepared other topics, or some would have prepared some other topics. So choice would essentially vary from your preparation. As a guidance student, if suppose I was writing, I remember what I have taken, what classes I've taken in the recent, for example, the 500 plus or the optional batch. So on the basis of that, there were so many of the direct questions. And if suppose I was a student who was writing, I would have probably chosen some of the questions like question number 2, if you talk about, there was lots of ambiguities related with question number 2. Abhi मैं बताऊंगा कि how to you would have answered this. But if I look into question number 2A, sequential changes in land use and land cover, again, this we have done in the classes. Maybe because of this, some would have chosen this question number 2. But if you look into the other questions were also challenging. Explain how various aspects of channel morphology. So on the applied aspect of channel morphology, the question has been asked. If you talk about The question number 2C, this would also make some students choose this question: relationship between ocean currents and the global surface winds. Explain the example. How does gyre in the northern hemisphere differs from the one in the southern hemisphere? Okay, so again, this is also we have second part specifically difference मैंने इस तरह से नहीं बताया है, but still the most of the part we have done in the class. ठीक है, I have told you little bit of difference, but इस तरह से direct नहीं बताया है मैंने. So if I was a guidance student, I would not select question number 2, मैं select नहीं करूंगा. ठीक है. However, if I look into the other questions, question number 3A, plants and animals that exist in particular ecosystems system are those that have been successful in adjusting to their habitats and environmental conditions. Elucidate with examples. Okay, so I would have 3A, सीधा सा क्वेश्चन है, इसको कर सकते थे. Question number 3B, with suitable examples describe the impact of movements of air masses on weather and wind in different parts of the continents. Remember जब मैंने air masses topic करवाया था, तो in the air masses topic I told you that question can be asked with a specific reference to some continents. Here they have overall asked about the continents. Remember I talked about how there can be North America as a continent example लेकर के हमने किया था, which are the air masses which are affecting. And question number 3, discuss the role of slope, altitude and relief in landscape development. So I believe if I was a student, probably I would have attempted question number 3. हालांकि मैं ये कह सकता हूं कि if there was one of my students who has done the 500 plus or the foundation classes, revised them properly multiple times, revision, the content is on the tips. Question number 2 was also not out of purview. It could have been written very, very well. Okay. But I know because most of the you people, तुम लोगों का होता क्या है कि तुम्हारे सामने बहुत अच्छा कंटेंट रखा हुआ है. But what happens, what is the problem? तुम लोगों का greed. The greed is so much high that you are not satisfied with that also. तुमको ये भी चाहिए, तुमको वो charts भी चाहिए, वो diagrams चाहिए, और कहीं से और content मिल जाता है तो वो भी चाहिए. कुछ toppers ने बोल दिया है कि books भी पढ़ना है तो books भी पढ़ने लगते हो. So what happens, your consolidation level is not up to the mark, and that is why I am saying that probably from a student perspective, question number 3 was a question which should have been chosen. So in section A, I would have chosen question number 3. Then coming to question number 4, rise of surface temperature brings severe consequences. Elaborate potential changes and threats associated with it in the world. A straightforward question of the impact of climate change. So again, I don't think that there was much not to write about this. Describe how short-term variations in temperature are related to the processes of receiving energy from the sun to Earth's surface and dissipating it to the atmosphere. So again, this was a little bit of tricky. याद है मैंने बताया था climatology में questions little bit tricky हो जा रहे हैं. So again, it is from that side. You should have, if you have prepared well, you could have written that. अभी देखेंगे कि इसको में क्या कर सकते थे. Then, with example of suitable sketches, describe the mountain genesis and mountain types. Give suitable example from various mountain systems of the world. So we have seen, if you remember, 4 types of mountains we have essentially talked about, particularly if you talk about from the perspective of mountain building or the fold mountains. Here, however, you can see that it is written mountain genesis. So that means there can be other type of mountains bhi baat kar sakte hain. So we'll see what we could have done. So for me, question number 4 was also not very difficult. It was easy. Probably I could have chosen question number 4, 3 and 4. ये दो क्वेश्चंस थे जो फिजिकल ज्योग्राफी से मेरे हिसाब से एक स्टूडेंट को अटेम्प्ट करने थे. ठीक है, if you wanted to do 2 questions from physical geography, both of them were very quite easy and attemptable. Maybe because of this question number 3C, some of the students can choose to write question number 4, but question number 4 may be B is a little bit tricky where you will have to think under pressure. So again, you would have to decide ultimately which one you would have answered. ठीक है? So question number 3 and 4 इसमें से दोनों कर सकते थे या फिर एक कर सकते थे. Now we know question number 5 was compulsory one, so we'll not go into the details of that. Then coming to question number 6, and question number 6 क्या है? Culture is a dynamic concept. Elucidate with examples. Again, we have done not the question directly, but we have talked about so many questions related with the change of cultural practices or the culture. Okay. So again, I think that this was a question which was attemptable for my students. We have seen how to write the answers of cultural geography. What was the framework? The answer should be written. So that was something which my students should have chosen. Automation is rapidly changing the economies of labor and will affect trade pattern in significant ways. Clarify. This is also something which I expect my students to answer that. Overcrowding leads to chronic problem of shortage of housing in Indian cities. Explain citing relevant examples. So from my side, question number 6 was something which could have been attempted. Question number 7, climate change is a serious problem to global food security and poverty eradication. Critically examine. Again, keyword was critical. Critical examination करना था. अभी देखेंगे how so many of them would have left this part critical. ठीक है? Critically examine the significance of quantitative revolution and its influence in the development of geography. Again, a very straightforward question. Explain in detail the impact of regional disparities on economic development. So you can understand question number 7. अब मैं इसमें calculate करूं तो probably there were some of the questions which were यहाँ पे ये question direct था, ये question बिल्कुल direct था from the class itself. This question I had to frame. Although हमने global food security की भी बात की है, it was also, I would say that it was a kind of direct question. तो मैं question number 7 को choose करूंगा because it was more direct one. Question number 6 में एक question है 6B जिसको हमने directly deal नहीं किया है. So अब पहले मुझे देखने से लगा कि 6 बहुत अच्छा है, but now when I'm reading the question number 7, this is something which I would prefer over 6. Now I have to read question number 8 and accordingly I would decide. How migration is affected by push-pull factors. Explain how these factors play a role in understanding of new settlement patterns. Again, a more direct type of question, in between direct and tricky, I would say, क्योंकि second part उसको थोड़ा सा tricky बना दे रहा है, तो it is in between direct and tricky category, I would say. Explain the relevance of applicability of von Thunen theory of agricultural location in today's world. सीधा question class का है, straightforward. Concept of rank size rule given by GK Ziff. Is the rule relevant for India's concept? Again, a more direct question which is there. So अब मुझे question number 8 question number 6 से ज़्यादा अच्छा लगने लगा. So probably I would have gone for question number 8. So if I would have, suppose if I was writing the choice based questions, दो questions मेरे बिल्कुल fix हो गए. Question number 7, question number 8, which I would have attempted, and also I would have attempted either question number 3 or question number 4, depending upon what is the level of your preparation. Okay, so I hope, tell me, how many of you have attempted similar category of questions? Agar if some of you who have already, who are giving this year and are writing, anyone? Okay, it seems that अभी बहुत सारे लोग पहुंच नहीं पाए हैं. Okay, so Anurag has talked about 1-5, it was compulsory, 3-7-8. Okay, very good, Anurag. Congratulations to you. And I think that you will also see that reflected in the results. The choice of questions was very important. Okay, so now let us return back and quickly glance through the paper and how this paper should have been written. So let us start with the first question, question number 1A. Now अब देखो इसमें कौन सा पहले क्वेश्चन करना था कौन सा बाद में करना था, मुझे लगता है कि हमेशा what we have to do, we have to mix it. We know that these choice based questions can give us more marks. So I always say that कम से कम two questions first do where you are very comfortable. Then what you do, you return back to question number 1. ओके, क्वेश्चन नंबर 1 विच वाज कंपलसरी क्वेश्चन, फिर उसको आकर के करो. मैं क्वेश्चन नंबर 1 पहले इसलिए नहीं बोल रहा हूं बिकॉज इनिशियली योर पेस इज स्लो ऑफ राइटिंग व्हेन यू आर स्टार्टिंग टू राइट द पेपर्स. ओके, सो उस टाइम पर होता क्या है कि इफ यू चूज क्वेश्चन नंबर 1 देयर आर 5 क्वेश्चंस इन दैट, you will be slowly writing. Ultimately what will happen, you will lose lots of time. Okay, so better is we start from some of the choice questions which we are very much comfortable with. So you return back to question number 1. Why question number 1 is important? Because it is the first impression it gives to the examiner. So that is very important. So that is why it should be attempted somewhere in between, when your speed has become fast and writing 5 questions won't take too much of time. Okay, so then you can choose whether you want to attempt question number 5 after question number 1, or you want to attempt some choice based question and then later go on to question number 5. Okay, so this is the way you should have chosen. Now let us very quickly discuss the questions which were there. So first question, as I said, always UPSC tests us psychologically. So question number 1A, define speleothem, discuss the various forms and features of speleothems. So it was a very straightforward question. और इसमें मैं क्या कर सकता था, when I'm writing this answer, I could have started with an introduction. Okay, so introduction में you could have directly started with what is speleothems, although it is the main body content. So I could have said speleothems, something like this. Speleothems are the significant landform features associated with the karst morphologies. So I would have associated speleothems with karst morphologies. Then what I would have done in the main body, I would have begun to talk about, or don't say कि speleothem क्लास में नहीं, फाउंडेशन बैच में बिल्कुल क्लियरली स्पीलियोथेम्स बताया गया है कि व्हाट आर एसेंशियली द स्पीलियोथेम्स, द स्टेलेक्टाइट्स, द स्टेलेग्माइट्स. ठीक है, सो वी हैड डन दो स्पीलियोथेम्स, although 1-2 times only I had used the term speleothems, but I have used. And जब कास्ट साइकिल बाकी क्लासेस में भी करवाता हूँ, always use the word speleothems. Okay, so when it comes to main body, first thing you will define what are speleothems. So speleothems, what are they are? They are the depositions which are essentially precipitates and are deposited where? In the caverns, caves and caverns associated with karst landforms. So again, I'll write the definition of this. Then the question was asking about the forms of the speleothems. So speleothems can be of essentially 2 types. One is essentially the drip stones, and second is essentially the flow stones. So drip stones and flow stones. Now obviously मैंने ये इस तरह से नहीं कराया था क्लास में, ड्रिप स्टोन फ्लो स्टोन नहीं करवाया था, बट सपोज मुझे नहीं पता था, बिकॉज दिस इज अ क्वेश्चन विच आई एम टेकिंग एज अ बाउंसर, और इसमें मुझे जितना भी मिल जाए, कुछ भी मार्क्स मिल जाए, 0 नहीं आना चाहिए. दैट इज द टारगेट. सो ड्रिप स्टोन में दिस वी हैव डन. वी हैव टॉक्ड अबाउट द stalactite, the stalagmites, and essentially the cave pillars or the columns. So these are the dripstones, and there are also some flow stones which are there. So कम से कम what you could have done, you could have talked about the various forms, और ये तीन तो लिखना ही था when you are talking about the speleothems. So one was related with the forms, and then there was related with the features of the speleothems. So अब features में, features is what? The characteristics. And there are various type of characteristics I could have talked about. For example, if I was writing this answer, I would have talked about how they are formed. And how they are formed, essentially they are formed as a result of two processes. One is the phenomena of carbonation plus the phenomena of precipitation. ठीक है, अभी मैं इसको एक्सप्लेन नहीं कर रहा हूं, आई विल बी एक्सप्लेनिंग इट व्हेन आई विल टेक द डिटेल्ड डिस्कशन. सो हाउ दे आर फॉर्म्ड यू कुड हैव टॉक्ड अबाउट. अब देखो यहां पर आता है प्रेजेंस ऑफ माइंड एंड रिवीजन. ठीक है, सो नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन आई वुड आस्क माई सेल्फ when they were formed or when they are formed. And if you have studied the karst cycle of erosion, you know that they are formed in the second stage of karst cycle of erosion. That is also one of their features. Then I would discuss the morphological features of these, और कम से कम ये तीन का मॉर्फोलॉजिकल फीचर्स आई कैन डिस्कस विथ डायग्राम. ऑब्वियसली आई कैन डू, इतना तो आता ही है. एंड अदर फीचर्स आई कैन टॉक अबाउट लाइक क्लाइमेट रिलेशंस दैट दे हैव, हाउ the type of prevalent climate would affect the growth and the morphology of the speleothems, that you should be talking about. In fact, this knowledge is also very, very useful for detecting the previous climate changes, like the quaternary, and if you talk about before that, the tertiary, some of the tertiary climate changes, mostly related till the quaternary climate changes. So again, climate relations I will talk about. So again, see, इतना लिखने में हमारा pages जो हैं with diagram, they would be full. And finally, what I can do, I can write about the conclusion, how, if you talk about how humans are impacting the speleothems, how the human beings are impacting the speleothems. So again, humans, we are impacting directly as well as indirectly. So एक example दे देता हूँ. Like for example, suppose in the karst areas, if you are making roads above the caves, okay, you are concretizing the land, what will happen? Can we say that the drip of water would stop? And this would mean that the speleothems growth would essentially stop. Okay, so again, that this thing should have been written in the conclusion, that how human beings are impacting. So that is the first basic question. Then, so this was something, हो सकता है कि आपको speleothem नहीं पता था. Then what would have happened? Maybe you were unable to answer that. If you were not at all aware about the speleothem, my suggestion would be that don't attempt this question. If you just bluff and you get it totally wrong, it might give a wrong impression to the examiner. Okay, so बिल्कुल अगर आइडिया नहीं था तो ब्लफिंग करने से कोई मतलब नहीं था. You could have saved the 6 minutes which you are getting to write this answer, and you could have distributed those 6 minutes in the other questions. Okay, so that is the case. Then what are high altitude environmental hazards? Explain with suitable examples. ठीक है, so high altitude environmental hazards. So environmental hazards which are created as a result of the high altitude scenario. So again you can understand ये high altitude environmental hazard पहले part में क्या है? What? And then it is saying explain with suitable example. So you'll identify the various types of high altitude environmental hazards. Like, so it was, you can understand it was a more straightforward question. And इसमें if I just talk about high altitude environmental hazards, they can be of geomorphological characteristics, they can be of meteorological characteristics, they can be of biological characteristics. So various type of environmental hazards, landslides, avalanches, glacial lake outburst, or in when I'm talking about meteorological cloud bursts, cold waves. In recent times we have seen in the Himalayas, there was also the phenomena related with the heat waves. Biological, in Himalayas we have seen that there has been forest fires. Okay, so various types. It was a more straightforward question. You just had to take up these and talk about the example. Then coming to what is a pollution dome and discuss its formation and impacts. ठीक है. So normally pollution dome जब आता है तो the first thing that would come to my spring to my mind is the atmosphere pollution which is taking place, and particularly in the urban areas. Okay, so I would have focused on this, although pollution domes can also be, for example, in the oceans, there can be pollution domes. If you had written, well and good. If you haven't written, essentially what will happen, I don't think that the examiner would be too much strict about that, because overall the psychology is, when we are talking about pollution domes, it is more related with the atmosphere, more importantly related with the urban atmosphere. Because in our syllabus there is a topic urban climate, so from there this question was essentially formed. So discuss its formation and impact. So when you are studying the urban climates, we know that there is the urban morphology, and this, if you talk about urban morphology, is present, and we know that there is this which is referred to as the UCL, that is the urban canopy layer, and there is what we call it as the urban boundary layer. ठीक है. So urban boundary layer. So what happens, we know that here is the low pressure and the air is rising. It is something like this. This kind of convection currents are formed. So we know that lots of, if you talk about pollutants, are concentrated or they are produced in the city environment or the urban environment, and these pollutants ultimately they become part of this urban environment, and because of these convection currents, because of the urban heat island effect, what happens, these pollutants are distributed in this urban environment, and this creates, you can see that this urban boundary layer, it is more like a dome like structure. So what happens, as it is fully distributed here in this, below this urban boundary layer, there is a dome of pollutants which is created. So that is basically the pollution domes. ठीक है. That is essentially the pollution domes. And again, when we'll discuss in detail, we'll talk about the causes. There are two type of causes or the reasons for the formation. One is, you'll talk about what are the meteorological factors, and the second one, if you talk about the pollution which is related, what is the source of the pollution which is there. And finally, the impacts, you can talk about. The impact will be, even the impacts, for example, you can divide it into various categories, like what would be the impact on the urban climate impact. You can talk about, for example, think if there is pollutants, will they make the atmosphere, urban atmosphere, more warmer? Obviously yes, and this would have impact on the other aspects of the climate. For example, if there is presence of urban pollutant, does it means that there is lots of hygroscopic nuclei which are present? Can it translate into greater precipitation? Yes, it can translate, or there can be related with this other forms of condensation like fogs, smogs. So you can definitely talk about that. Okay, then you can essentially also talk about the health impacts which can be there. Okay, अब यहाँ पर एक मैं और डाल सकता हूँ hazardous impacts जो हो सकते हैं, like for example can they lead to acid rains or acid precipitation, etc., etc. We can definitely talk about their impacts. Okay, so that is what had to be written. Question number 1D. When corals are affected by stress, it causes them to turn completely white. ठीक है. And if you talk about this question, एकदम सीधा क्वेश्चन है कोरल ब्लीचिंग का. एंड अगर क्लास में देखा है तो मैंने क्लास में बार बार मैं हमेशा यूज करता हूं एनवायरमेंटल स्ट्रेस. So that same wording has been actually used here, the environmental stress, which causes the corals to ultimately spit out the microalgae, that is the zooxanthellae living in their body, which leads to the phenomena of coral bleaching. Okay, so you will start with the phenomena of what is coral bleaching in this answer. You'll first talk about you because you would have identified, so you'll explain coral bleaching and how the spitting of the zooxanthellae causes the corals to bleach, and then you will explain the reasons. And when I'm talking about the reasons, first I will write these reasons in two ways. One, I will first highlight the reasons from a general point of view जो हम पढ़ते हैं, and then I will write also what has happened post 1970s. क्लास में मैंने करवाया है how there has been acceleration of the phenomena of coral bleaching, how it has become from a local to regional phenomena to ultimately a global phenomena because of the phenomena of global warming. So general में you will talk about several phenomena like the temperature change, like the solar irradiance, like the case of subaerial exposure, like the case of changes in salinity, like the case of sedimentation, like the case of nutrient supply, like the case of xenobiotic epizootics, and finally post 1970s you will also talk about the human impact and global warming. Okay, so all these should have been written. So अगर मैं इसको काउंट करूं 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 and how many points? 9 points are there. ठीक है. So now tell me कि कितने कितने पॉइंट्स लिखे थे. So Prakash also seemed to have attempted question number 378. Prakash, tell me how many of the points you had written. क्या ये सारे पॉइंट्स लिखे हैं? And this will make the difference between whether you are getting 7 marks or you'll get 3, 3.5, 4 maximum. This will make the difference in this very easy question. Then question number 1E, and it says well-developed soils typically exhibit distinct layers in their soil profile, and the key word here was elaborate. So it was all about finding or extracting what you mean by the well-developed soils. So well-developed soils are those where the time has been enough for the soils to ultimately develop their soil profile. So well developed soils typically exhibit distinct layers in the soil profile. So for me, well developed soils, if you talk about, are of two types, and these two are the zonal and the intrazonal soils. ठीक है? And the question was saying elaborate. So I'll talk about these well developed soils. Why? Because there was enough time for the processes, ठीक है, for the processes to operate. And as a result of this, what was happening, there was full development of the soil and its profile. Okay, and then what you will do, you will make the then you will talk about, because you have to elaborate here. So you'll say that this formation of the soils can take two forms. One is the case of the pedalfers and the other one is the case of pedocals. So pedalfers and pedocals. और फिर क्या करना है, इनमें एग्जाम्पल दे देने. लाइक फॉर एग्जाम्पल मैं जोनल का एग्जाम्पल दे सकता हूं एंड एक इंट्राजोनल का एग्जाम्पल दे सकता हूं. सेम थिंग हियर, one example you give of zonal and one example you give of intrazonal. ठीक है? अब इतना पता होना चाहिए कि जब हम फॉर एग्जाम्पल पेडाल्फर्स में जोनल की बात करते हैं तो उसमें क्या होता है, सम ऑफ द सॉइल होराइजन शुड बी मच मोर डेवलप्ड देन द अदर. ठीक है? एंड एज अ रिजल्ट what will happen, there will be, it will not be like the zonal soil profile. So some of these, like for example in many of the pedalfers which are intrazonal, the O layer, the organic layer is much more developed, and here we find that that more type of soils can be very commonly found in such profiles. Intrazonal में क्या होता है, in pedocals intrazonal you will find that there might be layers like the Dury crust. क्लास में हमने Dury crust किया था. So those Dury crusts can be found. That is the characteristics of the pedocals intrazonal. और zonal में अगर तुमको दिक्कत आ रही है तो चुल्लू भर पानी में डूब मरना चाहिए. If you hadn't studied this and if you are not able to write about the soil profile of the zonal soils. Like for example, when I am talking about the zonal soils, इसको कम से कम दो के एग्जाम्पल दे दूंगा. आई विल गिव द एग्जाम्पल ऑफ द एक तो लेटोसॉल्स का एग्जाम्पल दे दूंगा समझाने के लिए, एंड इफ यू टॉक अबाउट आई विल गिव द एग्जाम्पल ऑफ द पोर्टजोल सॉइल्स. तो ये दोनों एग्जाम्पल यहां पर दे दिए, एंड दैट इज हाउ आई विल मूव ऑन विद द डायग्राम्स विच वुड बी देयर. ठीक है? सो दिस वाज क्वेश्चन नंबर 1E. I sincerely believe that this year question number 1 was much easier than the other years. And that is what I said, this makes the paper comparatively easier. Now coming to question number 2, sequential changes in land use and land cover have brought global and regional ecological changes and imbalances. Okay, so if we look into this sequential changes in land use and land cover have brought global and regional ecological changes and imbalances elucidate. ठीक है? So sequential changes in land use and land cover. So tell me, हमने एक क्वेश्चन किया था in the classes, ecological adaptation of humans. Do you remember? Ecological adaptations of the human beings, which we talked in sequential manner, how humans have ecologically adapted. So one important ecological adaptation was human beings as or in harmony with nature. Do you remember? Then there was human beings, if you talk about, as determined by nature, and finally the third stage was the human beings as modifier of nature. So this has the kind of sequential change जो इम्पैक्ट हुआ है. ठीक है? सो इफ आई एम टॉकिंग अबाउट दिस सिक्वेंशियल चेंज, आई वुड हैव टेकन द फ्रेमवर्क ऑफ द स्टार्टिंग विथ हाउ hunter gatherers we were there. Then if you talk about, we started the early some early agricultural practices. There was development of pastoral systems. There was agrarian systems. And if you talk about, there are industrial and urban systems. ठीक है. सो ये स्टेजेस थी बेसिकली, और हमारा जो क्लास में पढ़ा था उसमें ये होता है ह्यूमंस इन हार्मनी with nature. Second, if you talk about, it was the humans as determined by nature. And if you talk about the humans as modifier of nature. ठीक है. सो ये तीन कैटेगरीज इफ यू टॉक अबाउट हमने क्लास में पढ़ी थी. दिस सेम कुड हैव बीन यूज्ड टू टॉक अबाउट द सीक्वेंशियल चेंज विच द ह्यूमन बीइंग्स वुड हैव डन इन द लैंड यूज एंड लैंड कवर. अब ये लैंड यूज लैंड कवर को कहाँ से लाते, इसके लिए कुछ इंफॉर्मेशंस. अगर तुम लोगों ने क्लास सही से की है, बोथ फाउंडेशन एंड 500+, तो मैंने एक क्वेश्चन करवाया है डिफॉरेस्टेशन, and there I have discussed this how in stages the deforestation has taken place and the rates of deforestation. ठीक है. सो वो rates of deforestation, वो जो figures वहां पे हमने पढ़ी थी, दोनों को mix करके what you could have done, you could have written a very very good answer. So यहाँ पर first part will be the change which has been brought, and the second part will be the global and regional ecological changes and imbalances पर आ जाओ. And imbalances per basically what you will do, you will talk about how this has brought, remember geographical pentagon which I have used so many times in the classes. So the lithosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere and the biosphere. And here was our anthroposphere, and this has been expanding, as a result of which what has happened with the other spheres, they are shrinking, and that is creating the global and regional changes which are there. और इसका मतलब है एक एक एग्जाम्पल लेकर के I could have written what are the type of changes or imbalances created in the lithosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere and biosphere. ठीक है. So this is basically the impact. और इसको बस यहाँ पर challenge क्या था, you had to relate it with the land use changes. All these you had to relate it with the land use changes. For example, there is increase in the events of landslides. Can I relate it with the land use changes? Yes. Similarly, atmosphere. We find that there are changes in the climate, global warming is taking place, and also there is regional की बात करनी है तो hydrological cycle changes like in monsoon. Can I relate it with the land use changes? Yes, I can relate it with the land use changes. ठीक है. Hydrosphere, again hydrological cycle का aspect, like for example class में याद करो हमने बात किया था, we talked about the river regimes. Can I relate these river regimes with the land use changes? Yes, I can do that. वो use कर सकते थे as an example. ठीक है. And again biosphere, how habitat shrinkage and everything is affecting. So that is how the answer should have been written. Very clearly this answer was challenging. That is why I said probably the students, the level which you people are, you shouldn't have attempted, because तुम लोगों को तो problems हैं, जो पढ़ाया जाता है उसमें तुम लोग खुश नहीं होते हो, greed तुम लोगों की इतनी ज़्यादा है कि ये भी पढ़ना है वो भी पढ़ना है, और उस चक्कर में जो पढ़ाया गया वो भी सही से नहीं पढ़ा. एंड दैट इज व्हाई आई एम सेइंग कि तुम लोगों के, यू आर नॉट एट द लेवल वेयर you could have attempted the question number 2. Then question number 2b, explain how various aspects of channel morphology are used in transportation, settlement and land use planning. Transportation, यहाँ पे कॉमा होना चाहिए, settlement and land use planning, flood control and flood management practices. So again, this was something which we have in some way or other discussed. चैनल मॉर्फोलॉजी में डिस्कस किया, लिंकेज आराम से बनाया जा सकता था. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, आई विल स्टार्ट हियर राइटिंग द आंसर विथ इन माय इंट्रोडक्शन इटसेल्फ. रिमेंबर, मैंने एक फॉर्मूला बनाया था कि जब टर्म जो पूछा गया, इट इज अ वेरी डिफिकल्ट, अनकॉमन, नॉट सो मच पॉपुलर टर्म, then you can start your introduction with the definition. So here you can start with define channel morphology, उससे start कर सकते थे. Then you will say main body में straight forward आ जाओ and you take the components with headings and you talk about how it would be useful. So I can take the case of transportation, how the studies of channel morphology are useful. So mainly if you talk about number of ways, for example, if you talk about the type of flow, that is very, very important, related with, ultimately is a very important factor which determines the transportation, because we have seen that there can be a laminar flow, there essentially can be a turbulent flow. So very clearly the laminar flow would be more useful for the transportation. This in turn, हमने जो क्लास में पढ़ा है, it is determined by the bed topography. So जो क्लास में हमने पढ़ा था bed topography के बारे में, that ultimately is a very key factor which determines the flow patterns. We have seen that if the bed is shallow and rougher, then what will happen? The flow pattern, if you talk about, would be essentially turbulent. For example, if we are talking about, दो तरह की rivers पढ़ी हैं हमने, alluvial channels and bedrock channels. So I can say where there is bedrock channels involved, the flow tends to become turbulent because there will be lots of potholes, etc., or there can be waterfalls, etc., rapids, cataracts. So the flow would become turbulent and that would essentially affect the transportation. So that is another factor. Another feature which we have studied is the feature of discharge. So discharge is another factor, that for transportation, even of the smaller ships, at least 2 meter, minimum of 2 meter, water level should be present in the river channels for small ships to be used for transportation. Ideal is minimum of 4 meter of water level should be present, the discharge should be higher, and that essentially would be determinative of the transportation. So देखो अब मैंने क्या किया, कीवर्ड्स, यहां पर सारा गेम किसका था, कीवर्ड्स को यूज करना एंड उसको लिंक करना कि हाउ इट वुड अफेक्ट द ट्रांसपोर्टेशन एंड हाउ इट इज रिलेटेड विद द ट्रांसपोर्टेशन. सिमिलरली सेकंड उसमें लिखा हुआ है सेटलमेंट एंड लैंड यूज प्लानिंग. सेटलमेंट एंड द लैंड यूज प्लानिंग. अब इस सेटलमेंट एंड लैंड यूज प्लानिंग में कम से कम दो चीजें बता सकते हैं. कैन वी से, एक मैं अर्बन पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से सोच लूंगा, दूसरा मैं किसके बारे में सोच लूंगा, रूरल पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से सोच लूंगा. सो इफ आई थिंक अबाउट रूरल पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू, टेल मी, डेवलपमेंट ऑफ कैनाल सिस्टम्स, डज इट अफेक्ट द सेटलमेंट्स एंड लैंड यूज प्लानिंग? कैन आई गिव, हमने क्लास में देखा इंदिरा गांधी कैनाल, how it has led to springing up of various compact settlements in that area. I could have talked about that. When I'm talking about the urban land use, I can essentially talk about the very crucial artificial drainage system. और जो मुंबई में फ्लड्स में केस स्टडी बताई थी, वो यहां पर essentially यूज कर सकते हैं. हाउ अर्बन फ्लड्स में एसेंशियली क्या हो रहा है, द मोस्ट ऑफ द artificial drainage systems which have been created, they are not adequate enough. They have not followed the principles of the channel morphology. And what we find that there is the problem of urban floods, which is recurring. It has become a recurring problem in India. So, इसके बारे में बात कर सकते थे. Then, if you talk about, we are talking about the flood control management. Flood control management. ठीक है. So again, flood control management में we can talk about phenomena like हमने पढ़ा है in flood topic channel correction. And can I relate this channel correction with the phenomena like जो हम channel morphology में पढ़ते हैं? Can I relate it with phenomena like bed topography, where we talked about, if you remember, the shoals, whether we have talked about the pools and riffles, how they are getting deposited in the bed capacity of the channel is reducing. Similarly, other things like the channel pattern. So remember, we have talked about the meandering channel pattern and how presence of a meandering channel pattern would make the rivers more prone to flooding. So essentially, straightening of the channel needs to be done. I can use all these things we can talk about. ठीक है? Yes, you can talk about the braided and anastomosing channel patterns. All those, just इसमें keywords relate. This is what you had to do. ठीक है? Similarly, if you talk about another is the creation of artificial levees. We could have understood this with the phenomena of the flood and other phenomena like avulsion से relate कर सकते थे इसको. ठीक है? So that is another important factor. Similarly, एक तरीका होता है flood management का water diversion. And again, water diversion कैसे करते हैं? It is done like you can build canal networks or other forms of diversion which can be done. And again, here the concept of channel morphology, particularly if you talk about the shape and the size of the channels, becomes very, very important. Okay. So इसमें बहुत important क्या होता है? The cross morphology studies. ठीक है? So I'll talk about the more details when I'll be taking the detailed discussion, but this is the general framework की बात कर रहे हैं. So this was our question number 2. Then coming to next question, question number 3. Plants and animals that exist in particular ecosystem are those that have been successful in adjusting to their habitat and environmental conditions. ठीक है? Elucidate with examples. Can I say nothing had to be done here? I would have taken the framework of biomes. बायोम्स का फ्रेमवर्क लेकर के हर बायोम का एग्जाम्पल दे सकते थे of adaptations which have taken place, animal and plant. We have done in the classes. ये क्वेश्चन मैंने 500 में केवल एक लिया था, मेडिटेरेनियन बायोम्स का डिस्कशन, बट in the foundation classes this have been done in more detail. ठीक है? So this question was again what, as I told you, question number 3 was one of the easier questions. So elucidate with examples. I don't think I need to discuss here because I'm just giving you an overview. When I'll discuss detailed discussion में I'll discuss कौन किस तरह से इसको examples के साथ लिख सकते थे. Question number 3B, with suitable examples describe the impacts of movement of air masses on weather and winds in different parts of the continents. So you have to take what suitable examples describe the impacts of the movement of air masses on weather and winds in the different parts of the continents. So do you remember हमने जब air masses का question किया था तो हमने एक चार्ट बना के वो क्वेश्चन किया था, डू यू रिमेंबर? एंड हियर वाज द टाइप्स ऑफ air masses, and here we had talked about the characteristics of air masses. So the source regions, other characteristics like temperature, humidity, stability, instability, and the modifications. ठीक है, और modifications में सपोज हमने लिया था CP winter, we had talked about the CP summer, we had talked about the MP winter. Similarly, we had talked about the MP summer. Similarly, इसी तरह से हमने समर एंड विंटर में empty air masses समर एंड विंटर का किया था, एंड CT air masses which we did समर और विंटर में हमने देखा था कि सेम होते हैं. ठीक है, सो ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ दैट, डू यू रिमेंबर हमने जब क्लास में किया था व्हाट टाइप ऑफ मॉडिफिकेशन towards when they are moving towards oceans and when they are moving towards land, और इसके एग्जांपल्स भी मैंने दिए थे टुवर्ड्स लैंड के. सो हर कैटेगरी में से यू हैव टू राइट व्हाट यू हैव टू डू, यू हैव टू चूज ईच ऑफ दीज कैटेगरीज इन दिस आंसर, एंड यू हैव टू चूज दिस वन जो मैंने टुवर्ड्स लैंड, बिकॉज इट इज सेइंग ऑन द कॉन्टिनेंट्स what type of changes it is bringing. ठीक है, and with the examples given, this way was the way the answer should have been written. So again, you can see that question number 3 was a straightforward, not totally based upon your memorization, not too much of trick involved. Question number 3C, discuss the role of slope, altitude and relief in landscape development. ठीक है, so the question is asking about three things: slope, altitude and relief in the landscape development. Slope is very clearly the angle, as we have seen. Altitude is the height above sea level, and if you remember relief, एक टर्म जब हम यूज कर रहे थे साइकिल ऑफ इरोजन में, सो रिलीफ इज बेसिकली व्हाट, इट इज द डिफरेंस इन लेवल ऑफ द माउंटेन summits and valley floor. So that is what we essentially mean by the relief. अब यहाँ पर basically what you had to do, you had to explain how it is affecting the landscape development. So slope में you could have taken the example of the slope theories से examples ले सकते थे. ठीक है, for example, remember we had talked about that if the slope is steep, then the landscape development follows the phenomena of parallel retreat when there is this free face fully present. Or you could have taken other example. Remember मैंने क्लास में करवाया था homoclinal structures. How many of you have written this? And how many of you have mentioned the homoclinal structures? किसी ने लिखा है? Remember मैंने homoclinal structure में बताया था when there is a very steep slope, rivers forms a V-shaped valley, both the angles are steep, this is formation of a hog back topography. Then if you remember, एंगल के हिसाब से सुएस्टा की बात की थी हमने, एंगल के हिसाब से हमने एस्कार्पमेंट्स की बात की थी, we had talked about the MESA. Was there anyone who is right now watching this video, was my student who has given this as example? Tell me. कोई नहीं है? At least no तो बोलो. And this is what I call it as the consolidation and revision. नहीं होता है तुम लोगों का. Similarly, then there is the factor of altitude. So how does the altitude affects? Remember when I was teaching Davis, how I had explained you that altitude, how it would affect the climate. So altitude, what it does, it affects the climate. And as it affects the climate, what it affects the type of process or geomorphic process which is operating. And if you talk about, it would also affect the intensity of the geomorphic process which is operating. So again you can explain, like हमने cycle of erosion में देखा है, when it was higher, what type of processes were operating, the intensity of the processes was high. When the landform is reduced, what was happening with the intensity of the processes? It was reducing. So that is one thing. Or if it is high, there might be very cold climates, glacial processes might be operating. When the landform is reduced, essentially what will happen? There will be no such glacial climates found. Or if it is too much high, it would intercept more precipitation. When it becomes lower, less precipitation is intercepted. So altitude. And then there is the factor of relief. अब यहां पर फिर से तुम डेविस को ला सकते थे. रिमेंबर हमने देखा था, रिमेंबर व्हेन वी वर टॉकिंग अबाउट द कंसेप्ट ऑफ ग्रेडेशन, तो मैंने उसमें तुम लोगों को समझाया था हाउ द रिलीफ बिकम्स a very important for the phenomena of slope decline which was taking place. So as this, why the slope was declining, do you remember? Because the relief was declining and thus the less amount of sediments were being brought, and essentially what was happening, there was slope decline phenomena taking place. So again you had to interrelate, यहाँ पर interrelate करके बहुत अच्छा आंसर लिखा जा सकता था. So that is basically your question number 3C. As I told you, I'll be taking a more detailed discussion later on. Then question number 4A, rise of surface temperature brings severe consequences. Elaborate potential changes and threats associated with it in the world. Rise of surface temperatures, it is global warming. So I don't think I need to explain it here. I will take it in the detailed discussion. It was a quite easy question. Describe how short-term variations in temperature are related to the processes of receiving energy from sun to earth's surface and dissipating it to the atmosphere. So now the question is asking about the short-term variations in temperature. Now the question arises, what you take it as the short-term variations in temperature. So can I say the short-term variations in temperature can be number of types, और यहाँ पर यही चीज explain करनी थी कि how there is the sun rays essentially are affected. So the short-term variations, tell me, can these short-term variations can be diurnal variations in temperatures? Can these short-term variations be the seasonal variations in temperature? Sometimes there can be, some of these can be inter-annual variations in temperature. Remember, ये inter-annual variations को मैंने एल नीनो साइकिल्स में समझाया है. ठीक है. In relatively short term, there can also be some solar cycles. ठीक है. So again, you can essentially talk about that how these factors are affecting the total amount of insolation which would be reaching to the earth's surface. और how much इसमें ये भी लिखा हुआ है ना, because there is dissipating it to the atmosphere. So energy from the sun to earth's surface and dissipating to the atmosphere. So again, the heat budget में जो concept पढ़ा है कि how the land is heated and ultimately the energy is dissipated into the atmosphere, or through the within the atmosphere also there can be dissipation of the energy which can take place. So again, you know, it depends upon the angle of the sun rays, seasonal. So it was a very elementary question. What I'm just trying to say, very elementary question. Ankit is asking, I think Ankit, you are asking about question number 4. Question number 3C के बारे में पूछ रहे हो? Yes or no? So I think, so Ankit is asking that whether I could have talked about Davis, Penck and Wood. लिख सकते थे, but you could have definitely written. बट यहाँ पर 3 एलिमेंट्स थे, तो वो इन 3 एलिमेंट्स के तीनों के बारे में लिखना था. दैट वाज द की. यू हैव टू अंडरस्टैंड दिस. ओके, सो व्हेन यू आर टॉकिंग अबाउट स्लोप, वहां पर यू कुड हैव डेफिनेटली रिटन दैट वेरी क्लियरली. द क्वेश्चन वाज नॉट ऑन स्ट्रक्चर. ये क्वेश्चन स्ट्रक्चर पे तो था ही नहीं. इट वाज अबाउट द रिलीफ. ठीक है. सो स्ट्रक्चर का यहाँ पर नहीं रोल था. यू डिडंट हैव टू राइट अबाउट द स्ट्रक्चर्स. Okay, so that is how question number 4B. Question number 4C, with the help of suitable sketches, describe the mountain genesis and mountain types and give suitable examples from various mountain systems of the world. So with the help of suitable sketches, describe the mountain genesis and mountain types. So देखो, अब इसमें if I talk about, I should have given around 25% of the space to all other type of mountains. Like I could have talked about the volcanic mountains, I could have talked about the simply the faulted or the block mountains, and I could have talked about the dissected mountains. मुझे पता है कि ज्यादातर लोगों ने इसको छोड़ दिया होगा. इधर इसको बाद में लिख लेते 25% और पहले से ही स्टार्ट करते, ताकि एग्जामिनर को पता चल जाता कि बच्चे के पास थोड़ा दिमाग है. Then 75% of my answer I should have written on the fold mountain systems of the world. और इसमें मैंने क्लास में 4 तरीके के फोल्ड माउंटेन सिस्टम्स करवाए हैं. ओशन कन्वर्जेंस, अगर याद हो तो इसमें ओशन कन्वर्जेंस में भी मैंने 2 तरीके के करवाए हैं. ठीक है. वन इज द collision type, which was the example was Japan and Philippines, if you remember, and the simply the subduction type, where the subduction was more smooth. Similarly, there was ocean continent. इसमें भी 2 type, इसके examples भी दिए हैं मैंने क्लास में. And there is continent, and the 4th one, the terrain collision. So obviously इसमें ज़्यादा explanation करने की का chance नहीं था. The diagram was the key, because the question itself is saying sketches. So diagrams were the key through which you should have explained. Okay, and examples were also the key. Okay, so this was the physical geography. Really, physical geography was easy. Now coming to question number 5, section B, and question number 5, it was analyze the effects of globalization on the languages. ठीक है. सो मैंने तुम लोगों को बताया, जब कल्चर की बात आती है तो हाउ आई हैव टू एसेंशियली राइट. सो हाउ द इफेक्ट ऑफ ग्लोबलाइजेशन ऑन द लैंग्वेजेस विच इज टेकिंग प्लेस. सो here I'll talk about the effects of globalization on the language. अब यहाँ पर देखो, हमने 4 तरह के चेंजेस की बात की है क्लास में. If you remember the diffusion theory which we have talked about, the cultural diffusion theory, and वो चारों कैटेगरी बना करके you examples would be the key through which it should be given. For example, think, can we say with the globalization phenomena there is the phenomena of hierarchical diffusion taking place? Like today we find that there is a kind of westernization culture which is emerging in the world. And due to this westernization culture, what we find, particularly the English language, is the language which has become the global language. It is the language of globalization. And with the prevalence of English language, now what is happening? There is hierarchy. From hierarchy, most of the information that is coming to the people, it is coming in the form of this language. And thus what is happening? People are forced to essentially, suppose you have to crack the exam, you belong to a area where English was not so much important, but what you are doing now, you are studying English. So there is a change. Now Hindi is converting into English as a result of which. So again, I can give this example. Then I can talk about the other form of diffusion, like we can talk about the contagion diffusion process. So again, contagion diffusion process, tell me, can we say here, I can give the example of information technology and communication, ITC, what it has done, it has led to shrinking of space and time, convergence of space and time, and as a result of which the contagion diffusion process is fast taking place. Now you can learn new languages, several changes in the languages are brought at faster rate because there is shrinkage of time and space. So that is again the growth of ITC has been one of the, in fact, it has been pushed by the phenomena of globalization. So I can talk about that. I can talk about there is globalization has led to migration diffusion. Like for example, याद करो हमने क्लास में example दिया tribal belt of India, the loss of languages which was taking place from the tribal belt of India. So essentially what is happening? Tribals are now forced to migrate, and when they are migrating into the newer areas, they learn the new languages. Ultimately, the next generation of the same tribals, they would be more fluent in those non-native languages, and slowly the native languages are being lost. So you could have taken the example of the migration diffusion and essentially a kind of missionary diffusion is also with globalization. What has happened? Even before globalization it was there, but it has become more. So now several missionaries, religious institutions, they are playing important role in the various areas, and English languages schools, now privatization is taking place, as a result of which this English languages schools are opening up, and again because of all these factors there is the change in the languages being driven. So key here was examples. When I'll take up the discussion in detail, I'll discuss along with the examples. Then 5B, shifting global trade patterns create new opportunities. Examine this statement. अब ये क्वेश्चन मैंने डायरेक्टली तो नहीं करवाया था, नो डाउट अबाउट दैट, बट हमने बहुत सारे फैक्टर्स पढ़े थे जिसके बेसिस पर ये क्वेश्चन करना चाहिए था. एंड शिफ्टिंग ग्लोबल ट्रेड पैटर्न, हमने शिफ्टिंग की बात की है बट अलग अलग बात की है. वी हैव टॉक्ड अबाउट द ट्रेड. इफ यू टॉक अबाउट इस बार के क्लासेस में 500 में वी हैव टॉक्ड अबाउट हाउ देयर वाज शिफ्टिंग इन द ट्रेड पैटर्न एंड व्हाट वर द कॉजेस फॉर दोज शिफ्टिंग ट्रेड पैटर्न. बट ये न्यू अपॉर्चुनिटीज डायरेक्टली डिस्कस नहीं किया था वहां पर, बट यू कुड हैव वेरी क्लियरली डिस्कस दिस न्यू अपॉर्चुनिटीज. सो अब इसमें क्या क्या लिखना था? फर्स्ट पार्ट, which will be around 30% of my answer, I will talk about the shifting trade patterns along with the map. Then the rest 70%, I will talk about that how, what are the opportunities, new opportunities which are emerging. So with the new opportunities, I can talk about the new opportunities which are related with manufacturing and particularly कौन सी countries के लिए, the developing countries. So remember हमने क्लास में पढ़ा है how we are in the era of post Fordism, and with post Fordism what has happened now, there is decentralized manufacturing. When we are using the word decentralized, it is at global level. Okay, so more decentralized manufacturing is taking place. So what is happening now? Remember we talked about how from a technology develops in the core areas, the developed countries, but because the MNCs which are having this, who develop these technologies, these MNCs headquarters यहाँ पर हैं. But what happens? The manufacturing plants are located where? In the developing countries and new areas, underdeveloped areas. As a result of which, now what is taking place? The manufacturing is being done where? In the developing countries. And as a result of this, there is new opportunities arising for these developing countries, like the case of China, India. You could have definitely given so many examples. हमने देखा है, and the made in China example, how China has become a very important trade power of the world. US in fact is today importing manufacturing products because of this phenomena. Okay, so you could have talked with respect to manufacturing, and when there is manufacturing changes taking place, can I say the resource patterns, there will be change in the resource distribution patterns, and this would definitely help several LDCs can be helped. Because for example, take the case of Bangladesh. Bangladesh हो गया, or you take the case of Myanmar. Now tell me, if in their vicinity there is development of countries like India and China, can they supply, can they sell their natural gas to these countries? Obviously, yes. And what it does, it gives ultimately the opportunities for export. So resource के point of view से सोच सकते थे. And similarly, we could have thought with respect to the services or service based industries. और अगर क्लास में याद हो तो मैंने तुम लोगों को क्लास में बताया था, नॉलेज थ्योरी पढ़ाई थी क्लास में, how this knowledge environment creation has led to the growth of several startups. And these startups again are creating the new paradigms, like you can talk about whether it is Infosys, etc., etc., how they have created the new paradigm in the trade of services. So again, this last May, you could have also mentioned the recent thing, the recent opportunity which opened up, for example, because of the COVID-19. उसकी बात कर सकते थे, like for example, India के लिए, how we became important vaccine manufacturer and supplier to the world. ठीक है, so again we could have essentially talked about. ठीक है, so that is how this answer should have been written. Then question number 5C, examine the morphological factors that influence the origin and growth of the towns. So if we talk about the morphological factors that are influencing the origin and growth of the towns, so इसमें दो पार्ट्स में बेसिकली हमें बात करनी थी. ठीक है, एक पार्ट में जो लेवल ऑफ इनिशियल morphology, initial morphology, ठीक है. So initial morphology plays a very important role in the origin of the towns. ठीक है. एंड ये इनिशियल मॉर्फोलॉजी में अगर तुम्हें याद हो तो हमने इस क्वेश्चन को हमने क्लास में डायरेक्टली नहीं किया था बट इनडायरेक्टली किया है. So if you remember initial morphology we had talked about in the rural settlement and these are nothing but your citing factors में हमने बात किया था. How the initial morphology can be helpful or citing factors में if you remember we had talked about the factor of topography. So how it plays an important role. अब इसमें examples दे सकते थे topography का. Remember हमने in between some of the class I have not in the same question but other I have discussed the example of the case of Delhi and the case of Mumbai. The case of Delhi and the case of Mumbai. So essentially what happens? We see that Delhi has followed a more concentric zone pattern of growth. It has grown more like a circular growth in all directions. Why? Because where it is located in the Indo-Gangetic plains. On the other hand, where Mumbai is located, what is there? On one side there is Arabian Sea, on the other side there is Western Ghats. And as a result of which, Mumbai's growth has been essentially which type? It has been more linear because of that factor. So again, जो citing factors में हमने पढ़ा था वो दिमाग लगा करके यहाँ पर essentially लिखना था. So the initial morphology of the landscape, it definitely plays the very important role in the origin. इसमें और citing factors की बात कर सकते थे. We can talk about the presence of water, जैसे कि river bank settlements जो बनते हैं. So several such जो हमने citing factors में बात किया था, you could have taken up and you could have talked about. Similarly, the question is saying morphological factors that influence the origin and growth of the towns. So अब यहां पर और भी morphological factors हो सकते हैं, like हमने city morphology पढ़ा है, तो city morphological factors can be there. For example, tell me, can we say that there can be two type of basic cities? One is the one which grew from a single nuclei. In single nuclei city, the pattern of growth would be what? It would be different. If it was a planned city and the morphology was planned from before, if you talk about it was the multiple nuclei city, then if you remember हमने example लिया था चंडीगढ़ का. We had taken the example of Chandigarh and essentially it is a multiple nuclei city, so its growth was very different. It was more like a grid pattern city and it was different from what was happening in a single nuclei city. So again इस तरह से city morphology के basis पर इसको explain कर सकते थे. That was the way you should have written. Then question number 5D, discuss the role of transportation accessibility in the regional development. अगर किसी मेरे स्टूडेंट का इसमें मतलब इफ यू रियली फेल्ट कि अगर ये क्वेश्चन नहीं लिख पाओगे तो चुल्लू भर पानी भी मतलब आई कैन से दैट इट इज more than enough for you. I have almost devoted 2 to 3 hours in just dealing with this transportation and regional development question. ठीक है. So इसका जो framework था, it was very simple. इसमें when you are writing about the main body, in the main body, first part, general part में लिखोगे about the role of transport accessibility in regional development, and here you will use the terms that we had used in the class. जो concepts use किए थे, time and space compression, and how this time and space compression, what it does, it leads to diffusion of information or technology, and ultimately how it creates the engine of growth. So first will be the general पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से लिखेंगे। देन यहां पर जो लिखा है, फिर हमने क्लास में जैसे किया था रोड के लिए, वी हैव सीन हाउ रोड लीड्स टू कॉरिडोर टाइप ऑफ डेवलपमेंट, रेलवे how it leads to, how it creates accessibility and terminal type of developments which are created because of the railway. Similarly, the ports, so remember we talked about the gateway cities. Similarly, the air transport, and similarly the pipelines. So ये सब हमने डिस्कस किया था, सब पे एक एक लाइन एग्जाम्पल्स के साथ लिखना था. दैट वाज the thing you could have answered this. Question number 5, we explain the geometrical boundaries with examples. A very traditional question. इसमें कुछ भी नहीं था. You just had to talk about the geometrical boundaries which are there, like for example the kind of superimposed boundaries which have been created. ठीक है, अफ्रीका में हमने देखा example. New World is a very good example where the such geometrical boundaries are essentially found. So again a very straightforward question. Then question number 6, and इसमें culture is a dynamic concept, elucidate with examples. ठीक है, फिर से वही फंडा, फिर से वही, it was all about this. The framework हमने क्लास में किया है कि how there is the change taking place. So first you will do what? You'll start your answer with defining the culture, which is basically what? It is sum total of the way of life of the people. And there can be several, the cultural change. Now you have to, in the main body, you will show the dynamic aspect of the culture, how it can be very dynamic. अब फिर से वही framework लो. You can take the hierarchical. Diffusions can be very, very common phenomena taking place in culture. Remember मैंने example लिया था क्लास में green revolution का, how green revolution changed the agricultural pattern. We know economy is also part of the culture. So agricultural pattern, और भी examples you could have taken. Similarly, और इसमें हमने हायरार्किकल डिफ्यूजन में लैंग्वेज का एग्जाम्पल ले सकते हो. सेवरल सच एग्जाम्पल्स कुड बी टेकन. और द वेस्टर्नाइजेशन एग्जाम्पल ले सकते हो. सेवरल ऑफ देम यू कुड हैव टेकन. देन देयर इज द फिनोमेना ऑफ contagion diffusion. So how there is from person to person the cultures are essentially spreading. So particularly when you are talking about, you can talk about the border areas of cultural regions का essentially example लेकर के you can talk about how dynamism is there, how there is fast change in the language which is there, economic practices, how they are changing in those areas. ठीक है, जब क्लास में डिटेल में करेंगे तो एग्जाम्पल इंडिया से केस स्टडी उठा के करेंगे इसको. ठीक है, सो दैट इज वी कैन टॉक अबाउट. देन वी कैन टॉक अबाउट द अदर फॉर्म्स ऑफ कल्चरल चेंज, माइग्रेशन, डिफ्यूजन, हाउ दिस इज लीडिंग टू. सो वो सेम फैक्टर्स जो हमने बात किए, द ओनली थिंग दैट विल बी चेंजिंग विल बी द एग्जाम्पल्स एंड द केस स्टडीज. Then question number 6b, and question number 6b says automation is rapidly changing the economies of labor and will affect trade pattern in significant ways. Clarify. So this was a question which was a kind of challenging thoda sa tha, but again, so if I was writing this answer, automation, how it is changing the labor economies and how in turn it would affect the trade patterns. So I would have written this under this framework. So automation. So automation is leading to number of things. With automation, what is being done? One negative which is associated with automation is the labor cost cutting or labor cost cutting. And tell me, can we give example of countries which are developed countries? Can you take the example of Japan, for example, where automation is very, very high? And with the help of automation, what is still taking place? Japan is still very, very important manufacturer of the world. Okay? And if the automation is developed at the level the developed world wants, probably the phenomena of delocalization which we are seeing today, maybe that delocalization phenomena can stop. ठीक है? So labor cost cutting automation से जोड़ दो and you talk about how it is there. Then you can talk about other phenomena like you can talk about with automation what has taken place is there is expansion of critical isodapane. ये क्लास में मैंने करवाया है. Expansion of the critical isodapane. कैसे? With the automation, everything, with the development of new technologies, what has essentially taken place? Very clearly now, the labor can be situated in other places and still through the phenomena of automation can be done, can be monitored, can be managed. Okay. So with this, what will happen? It would very clearly create new opportunities in the developing countries. So there will be a positive impact of the phenomena of automation. Examples, you can, so many examples you can give. The case of the China ka example, the made in China is a very, very good example of that. If you talk about the other examples like India ka example, service sectors, how it has grown. Third, you have to talk about how the automation has impacted labor mobility. So with automation, what has taken place? Transportation has also become more efficient. Okay. And essentially the labor mobility, particularly in which areas, particularly within the countries, it has also changed. Like take the example of India. We find that with the automation, with the development of technology, the labor mobility is also increasing. More people are moving toward the south. And that is also one of the factors which is very clearly going to change the manufacturing phenomena. So you have talked about this, show that how this is going to change the pattern of manufacturing and services and thus it would have impact on the trade. जो पिछले question में किया था, you'll just show that the same thing. So that is one. Question number 6C, overcrowding leads to chronic problems of shortage of housing in Indian cities. So overcrowding leads to chronic problem of shortage in housing in Indian cities. Explain citing relevant examples. ठीक है. अब यहां पर relevant examples मैंने कहां पर दिए थे तुम लोगों को? मैंने एक पीपीटी दी थी जिस पीपीटी में स्लम्स का बहुत सारा डाटा था. And that slum is basically what? Slum is an example of housing crisis. This is the reason why people are forced to essentially live in the slums. So if you knew which are the cities where there is more, if you talk about slums which are essentially present, then what will happen? Very, very clearly, you can use that data to support ये जो examples की बात कर रहा है, उसको support करने के लिए हम यहाँ पर यूज कर सकते थे. ठीक है. तो ये क्वेश्चन जो था इट वाज अ मोर ऑफ अ इंडिया के कंटेक्स्ट में था. सो अगर तुम्हें याद है तो इंडिया के कंटेक्स्ट में व्हाट वी हैव सीन दैट द हाउसिंग क्राइसिस इज अ वेरी वेरी बिग फिनोमेना इन विच सिटीज ऑफ इंडिया. इट इज मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट इन द मेट्रोपॉलिटन सिटीज ऑफ इंडिया. सो हमने क्लास में याद किया करो बताया था मेट्रोपोलाइजेशन प्रोसेस which has become dominant in India. Remember, we talked about how it is leading to the growth of the 52 metropolitan cities where, if you remember, हमने देखा था that the stepped migration process has been bypassed, and that was leading to this phenomena of metropolization. And the same, what is happening here is the intervening opportunities essentially are missing, and that is leading to the overcrowding. So starting मैंने कैसे किया? I explained the phenomena of overcrowding. Why this overcrowding is taking place? Because our cities are overburdened. Remember हमने ये वाले diagrams बनाए थे, the pyramid of number of cities and pyramid of urban population. So in population, this is inverted pyramid. And that is essentially because of that, what is happening? There is this overcrowding taking place. So वहां से ये overcrowding के part को 30% weightage दे करके लिखना था. And from there, you talk about the phenomena of 70%, which is talking about it is leading to chronic problem of shortage of housing in the Indian cities. ठीक है, so shortage in the housing, if you talk about housing, it is reflected in number of things, the property prices and the slums. अब इस क्वेश्चन में बहुत सिंपल सी बात है, डाटा बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट था. ठीक है, इफ यू डिड नॉट हैड दैट इंफॉर्मेशन टू सपोर्ट व्हाट यू आर सेइंग, देन व्हाट वुड हैव हैपेंड? इट वाज बेटर नॉट टू राइट दिस आंसर. तो यू विल राइट दिस. अब इसमें लास्ट पार्ट में what you can say, this will be the last part. You can also say that this housing problem is also function of other factors, not just overcrowding. अब देखो क्यों मैं ये कह रहा हूं कि just last part, because अगर यहां पर explain के बजाय होता discuss, examine, critically examine, तब मैं other factors की भी बात करता. बट यहां पर इसने बोला overcrowding is the reason. तो overcrowding पे ही फोकस करना है. एंड इसके लिए और जो रेलिवेंट डाटा मैंने क्लास में करवाया है, इफ यू रिमेंबर, जब इसमें तुम एग्जाम्पल्स लोगे तो जो 4 मेट्रोपॉलिटन सिटीज के हमने एग्जाम्पल किए थे क्लास में, you should have taken those examples and you could have talked about how the population growth has taken place in those, and this is the reason why they are facing the problem. Or you could have taken any one of those metropolitan cities and you could have talked about why they are facing this problem. ठीक है, लास्ट पार्ट में you talk about the other factors as well. और other factors में if you remember हमने देखा है city morphology is also a problem. The morphology of the city is essentially it has followed a which type of sprawl? Essentially most of Indian cities there is horizontal sprawl phenomena which has taken place. Vertical sprawl has been limited, and this is one of the issues which is leading to this housing crisis in India. Then there are other factors like the real estate के बारे में अगर तुम्हें याद हो तो मैंने क्लास में करवाया था, how they have also reinforced this horizontal sprawl phenomena. So again I would talk about the factors, other factors, but वो short में होगा because that is not being asked by the question. Then question number 7. Climate change is a serious problem to global food security and poverty eradication. Critically examine. Question number 7A. अब यहां पर देखो, it is changed. Critically examine हो गया. ठीक है, इसका मतलब है this is a very straightforward question. 50% of the main body I will be writing on supporting this idea. That how if you talk about the climate change is posing a serious problem to global food security and poverty eradication. So you'll talk about how, what type of impacts it would have, how it would impact the food security, how it would lead to change in the other type of expenditures like health expenditure, how if you talk about there will be problems like migration, forced migrations would follow, how it would further lead to more number of people becoming poor. So several such things you'll be writing. You'll first support the answer. Then what you will do, 50% you will also write against this idea. तो जब अब इसके अगेंस्ट कैसे लिखना है, जब हम सपोर्ट कर रहे हैं तो टेल मी, आर वी माल्थुसियन? ऑब्वियसली यस, वी आर माल्थुसियन. एंड रिमेंबर, हमेशा मैं क्लास में कराता हूं आई इज इक्वल टू पैट. सो माल्थुसियन हो गया, ए की बात कर लेंगे, टी की बात कर लेंगे. सो 50% में विल राइट हाउ दिस इज ऑल्सो द प्रॉब्लम ऑफ टेक्नोलॉजी. It is related with technology. So if there is increase in global food security and poverty increases because we haven't been able to develop such kind of technologies. ठीक है? And again, we know this is the cornucopian view, and this, if you talk about, is next you will talk about the distribution of resources. Problem will be the distribution of resources. And remember, हमने क्लास में देखा the Marxist approach, the Marxist view would be taken. अब मुझे पता है कि मेरे ही स्टूडेंट्स 60% ये केवल यहीं तक होंगे. देवर 60% of them would have not written this. Why? Because they were not revising. When the time was there, they were busy indulging in the extravaganzas of UPSC collection of material. ठीक है? So that is the question. अब question number 7B, सीधा सीधा question है. Critically examine the significance of quantitative revolution and its influences in development of geography. So अगर याद है तो we have talked about how Schaeffer what advocated and how it resulted in geography developing on particular lines. ठीक है? So in this answer you will start with quantitative revolution. You will, because the question is saying again, critically examine the significance of quantitative revolution. So you'll write about the shortcomings which was there of the quantitative revolution, and you will talk about then how still it has contributed and how it has contributed to the development of the discipline. ये question other words में सीधा question class में किया हमने. ठीक है? Similarly, explain in detail the impact of regional disparities on economic development. Again, a direct question. सीधा सीधा question है ये, and I don't think we need to elaborate much. In detail, impact of regional disparities on the economic development. So regional disparities say various problems which would be created, how regional disparities would thwart. If you talk about the agriculture development would be affected because of that, the resource distribution, how it would create. If you talk about industrial development problems, or how, if you talk about, it would create the issues of separatism, regionalism. So सीधा सीधा you will be basically talking about. So this was question number C. अब इसमें क्या हुआ होगा? Some people would have not read the question properly. And since they wouldn't have read the question properly, जो मैंने क्लास में क्वेश्चन कराया था, सीधा सीधा उसको बिना मॉडिफाई किए हुए, what they would have done, they would have written the same answer. But वो क्वेश्चन थोड़ा डिफरेंट था. And what was that question? The question was the causes of economic disparity. Here it is saying regional disparity and how it impacts regional or economic development. ठीक है? So again, you can take one example from resource, one example from agriculture, one example from industry. Okay. Even you can take one example from transport. You can take ultimately how it can lead to the regionalism, separatism, all these would combine and can even become a more bigger problem of law and order issues which would not have conducive environment for development. ठीक है? Then question number 8A, how migration is affected by the push and pull factors. Explain how these factors play role in understanding of the new settlement pattern. So this was also a more straightforward question. Just you had to link second part, थोड़ा सा दिमाग लगाना था. So migration, when we are talking about, it is affected by push and pull factors. तो पुश फैक्टर्स में हम दो तरीके के फैक्टर्स के बात कर सकते थे. एंड इफ यू टॉक अबाउट द पुश फैक्टर्स कैन बी voluntary factors, it can be involuntary factors. This can be related with economic, it can be related with social. ठीक है. Similarly here it can be related with social or cultural, can be related with economic factors, it can be related with political factors. In सब के examples दिए हैं, like social, voluntary. If you talk about, there have been, if you talk about migration of people who belong to the lower caste, and lower caste people have done what? They have migrated to other areas, formed new settlements. So again वो examples हैं, but first level पे केवल factors. Question क्या कह रहा है? It is saying how migration is affected by push and pull factors. So you'll talk about how this will be ultimately generating the migrants. Push factors are generating the migrants, and also the pull factors, they are attracting the migrants towards the destination. So pull factors में mainly the pull factors is the real or the perceived opportunities. This can be economic, social opportunities, so various such kind of real or perceived opportunities. So ये explain करना था. And if you wanted, इसमें कुछ theories भी use कर सकते थे. ठीक है. I'll be talking about when I'll take the discussion, detailed discussion. So some theories also are there where it is talking about the push and pull factors. So that can have been done. Explain these factors, how they are playing role in understanding new settlement patterns. So new settlement patterns में अब यहाँ पर हमें clearly क्या करना है? New settlement patterns दो तरीके से सोचना है. How they are creating new rural settlement patterns, how they can essentially create. ठीक है. So if you remember, हमने बात किया है compact settlement patterns, how they can be created, like the Indira Gandhi canal region के बारे में हमने बात किया था. Compact rural settlements have been created. Semi compact, याद करो हमने बात किया था social factors, how the lower caste groups, they are migrating and creating new settlements nearby, so that is leading to semi compact settlements creation. And there can also be such examples can be found in the dispersed. So तीनों के example लेकर के you'll have to explain. Then the urban settlement pattern, and urban settlement pattern में दो pattern हम यहाँ पर बात कर सकते हैं जो हमने क्लास में भी बात की है. One was the how it is leading to creation of primate city pattern or the phenomena of metropolization, जो इंडिया में मैंने example दिया था, how it is taking place. And the other is a more balanced level of development, that is the rank size rule patterns जो developed countries में है. ठीक है. Where the migration, if you talk about the pattern of migration, is the stepped migration pattern which was talked about by the Revenstein. So again that is basically general, जो basic knowledge है वो अच्छा होना चाहिए for writing this question, and then you will be able to write. Then question number 8b, explain the relevance and applicability of von Thunen theory of agricultural location in today's world. It is a very straightforward question, so I don't think here there is a need for me to discuss. Basically, as we have discussed in the classes, we will talk about how the idea of land rent is so much useful of von Thunen, how this concept which were given by von Thunen can be utilized to explain the agricultural pattern of the world. So one, you can have taken that US example, US cropping regions example. Then agricultural intensity. Second, you could have taken the example of Europe to talk about that. Okay. Then if you talk about हमने वॉन थ्यूनेन मॉडल को सिटी मॉर्फोलॉजी में भी लगाया था, ठीक है। So land rent का concept, how it was useful given by that. So all of these with explanation and examples should have been written, जैसे हमने सीधा सीधा ये क्वेश्चन क्लास में किया है, ठीक है। Then question number 8C, discuss the concept of rank size rule given by GK Ziff. Straightforward. Is this rule relevant in Indian context? No, this rule is not relevant in Indian context. You can write about the study which was done by Qazi Ahmad, and he found that there was hardly any states of India which were where it was applicable. The only state he found little bit of applicability was Rajasthan. Okay. सो अगेन वो सारी चीज़ें यहाँ पर एसेंशियली मेंशन कर देनी है क्लास में। फाउंडेशन बैच में ये सेकंड पार्ट 500 में मैंने नहीं करवाया था फाउंडेशन बैच में, बट ये सेकंड पार्ट सीधा सीधा करवाया गया, द रेलेवेंस ऑफ द रैंक साइज रूल इन इंडियन सेटिंग, ठीक है। सो फ्रेंड्स, दिस वाज द पेपर, एंड इफ यू टॉक अबाउट I really think that this was one of the easier papers which have been asked in recent times. UPSC इस बार ऑप्शनल में इसका रिजल्ट पे भी असर दिखना चाहिए. So I really believe this year the results should be a kind of good results. But फिर भी I would say that too many of you are indulged in that extravaganza which is called UPSC knowledge and content gathering, but उसका consolidation कोई नहीं कर रहा है. Many of you who are my students, you would have realized when I am discussing this now कि कितनी सारी चीजें थी जो तुम यूज कर सकते थे, सब क्लास से था. But just because of lack of revision, you were unable to do so. ठीक है. Now one more announcement is there, and this announcement is that we will be starting one new program, a small ticket size program, and this is the geography optional previous year question and answer program. So what I have found many times when students are new, they are coming into the preparation, they always want the solution of the previous year question, because we also tell you to solve the previous year questions. But when you are solving these previous year questions, what happens? You don't know how to evaluate yourself. Okay? And believe me, UPSC, solving the previous year questions of UPSC is better than any test series which is available in the market. You cannot compare it, because that is ultimately the case. And as you know, 2009, हमेशा मैं कहता हूँ 2009 has been the watershed year from where the papers change. So what we will be doing this analysis, previous year question analysis in detail with PPTs, and lots of content would be given to you of the past 14 years. From 2009 to 2022, the program starts from 1st of October. Okay, 50% of the questions would be taken by me, 50% of the questions would be taken by Pranjal sir, and that is how we will be essentially doing that. Okay, and more information I will be giving you. The schedule also I'll give you tomorrow of this program. It is something, what is the problem? देखो होता क्या है, students are searching for the source to check, and they'll go to check to some substandard sources. There are some sources which have written answers of geography optional, but they're really substandard. अगर उस तरह से answers लिखोगे तो हो गया तुम्हारा काम. You're sure that you'll not get very good marks in the examination. So this is a program which will give you lots of insight and lots of help. It will be year-wise discussion. So for example, on 1st, there will be discussion, 1st October, there will be discussion of 2022. And then what will happen? There will be discussion, we'll go backwards. 2021, then 2020, likewise, we will be going backwards. Okay. So now let me see your questions. Ankit, you can definitely, I will be able to help you. You have to call the office and try to connect to me. Timing of the regular batch, it is starting, a new batch is starting from tomorrow, 2:30 p.m. You can come, first 3 days are open. जानी इज आस्किंग प्रेप लैडर पे GS1 ज्योग्राफी का डिस्कशन आएगा? डेफिनेटली आएगा नीरव जानी, बट मेरे द्वारा नहीं आएगा, बिकॉज आई हैव लेफ्ट प्रेप लैडर। तो उसका डिस्कशन जल्दी गाइडेंस के वेबसाइट पे आ जाएगा, गाइडेंस के यूट्यूब चैनल पे। ओके, थैंक्स अंकित फॉर रिकॉग्नाइजिंग द गुड वर्क and keep spreading the good word. It would be motivating for me also to keep on doing what I have been doing for so long. ठीक है? So I'll stop for today. Okay, so I'll be stopping for today. Goodbye, take care.